Amen. Fear is not my future. What about you? All right. Okay, I'm Kayla, a grateful believer in Jesus. I've come a long way, but I still struggle with people pleasing and codependency. And tonight we're going to talk about fear. Excuse me. Okay, so fear is something that can be paralyzing, or it can be very motivating. It depends on how you look at it. It depends on how you use it. It depends on how you respond to it. So we are going to define fear as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that something or someone is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or likely to cause a threat. There are three basic types of fear. One is irrational fear. This occurs when there is a real imminent threat. So this is like if you're in a crowded place and you lose your kid. That's irrational for you to be afraid in that moment. If you're camping in the woods and everyone's laid in the tent and you hear a branch snap somewhere nearby, I would probably legitimately be a little nervous if that happened. Maybe if you're on an airplane and there's too much turbulence, that could be rational for you to be a little nervous in that moment. Then there are primal fears. Primal fear is defined as an innate fear that is programmed into our brains, so like fear of the dark. There's nothing you can really do about the dark except turn a light on, but it's kind of normal and just programmed into us that we have like a natural fear of the dark, or we have a natural fear of heights, close enclosed spaces. Is anybody in here claustrophobic? Yeah, okay. I wasn't when I was younger, and I think as I've gotten older, smaller spaces are like, this is weird, get me out of here. Fire. We're innately afraid of fire. It's hot. It's scary. We just know to stay away from it, and no one really has to teach us that necessarily. Excuse me, y'all. And then sudden loud noises. Then we also have irrational fears. Those are the ones that don't really make logical sense, and they can vary between person to person. So I'm going to share with you a few of the I'm kind of nervous to say that they're funny or silly because some of you may have these. So just don't be offended, whatever I say. Don't take it personal. We are real. Okay, so there's one that's called chirophobia, and that is the fear of blankets. Does anyone want to admit to having a fear of blankets? Apparently it's a real thing. I don't know. Some of these I don't even know how to pronounce, so I'm going to try. There's one, thank you. There's one that is called, I think it's megarocophobia. I think I have this one. Not really, but it's the fear of cooking or the idea of cooking. That's why my husband cooks. You may experience intense anxiety or go out of your way to avoid cooking, and this is why we eat out all the time, because I don't want to. Okay, another one I found is brumotactilophobia. It's an irrational fear of different food items touching each other. Food separation disorder. Do y'all like the food on your plate to be separate? You don't want it to touch. It's a phobia. Okay, I have a couple more and then we'll get to the serious part. Okay, this one, I think it's mortusecus phobia. It's a fear of ketchup, guys. Is anybody afraid of ketchup? Okay. And then this one is the best one. Are you ready? Hippopotomonstrosesquipedaliophobia. All one word. Is the fear of long words. And it's the longest word in the dictionary. Okay. So there's that. That was just, get y'all thinking about all the different random things you can be afraid of. Right? Okay. So let's talk. We're here in recovery. We're going to talk about recovery. We're on the journey. So let's talk about the fears that are most often associated with substance abuse. I thought this was interesting. So the very first one that was listed as being associated with substance abuse is social phobias. You panic at parties, social gatherings, or even during small and brief interactions. People with this phobia are at an incredibly high risk of turning to alcohol as a social lubricant and a way to avoid fear and anxiety when out in public. And I hope this is okay, but I thought of you, Pastor Jeff, because you've talked before about back in the day, I think it was you would drink and it would calm you down. It would like make you feel more comfortable. Yeah. So it's a real thing. People with social phobia are also at risk of isolating themselves and becoming depressed if they do not have treatment or intervention. Another one that was high on the list is a fear of crowds, which kind of goes along with the social phobia. It's also associated with high rates of drug or alcohol abuse. People with this phobia find the movement and noise of crowds disorienting and stressful. They will find it impossible to join groups or be in the presence of a crowd without triggering intense anxiety symptoms. And then the third one that was listed is a fear of pain, being in pain. This is associated with drug and alcohol abuse. People with this fear are terrified of feeling even the slightest amount of pain. Unfortunately, their fear of pain makes them more likely to believe that any pain signals are more intense than they actually are. So then that increases their risk of using narcotics to numb the pain that isn't even there, or it could be there, but it's probably not as bad as they think. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. Then I had, since we're here in recovery, I looked up things that people fear in recovery. When I first found out that I was going to do the lesson on fear, one of the first things that I thought of was being afraid of your recovery, being afraid of who you're going to be when you're on the other side, which we know that it's always a journey. It's something that we're always working towards. But when you're on the other side, when you're 2 years sober, when you're 5 years sober, when you're 20 years sober, who is that person? What is my life going to look like? I've lived this way for so long. And so I'm afraid to even go there. I don't know what I'm going to be like when I get there, you know? So one of them was fear of facing everything. So we're going to use the acronym FACE, Everything, and Recover. That's FEAR, Face, Everything, and Recover. Common fears in recovery from addiction can include the fear of facing everything to do with addiction recovery, from short-term lifestyle changes to concerns about long-term sobriety. For many people in recovery, this fear can be overwhelming and trigger a feeling of hopelessness. It's important to remember that these fears are normal and that they do not have to control your life. Face everything and recover. This means that while it can be difficult, uncomfortable, or scary to confront your addiction while sober, you can do it as you recover. Remember, you do not have to face everything all in one day. Let me say that again. You do not have to face and fix everything all in one day. It's impossible. Take one step at a time and deal with the day ahead of you. The only way out is through, and you can do this. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Join a support group. Reach out to a therapist or a counselor, etc. The next one I wanted to talk about is fear of sobriety. It's normal to fear sobriety or feel the fear of not being able to live a normal life. While those fears may seem insurmountable, it is important to remember that they're only temporary. There's often initial fear in addiction recovery. With time and effort, you can overcome your fears and build a foundation of lasting recovery. The first step is to understand what is causing your fear. Maybe make a list of fears and pray over it. Whatever helps you. If you're visual, that's probably a good thing to try. Once you've identified your fears and the source of your anxiety, you can begin to develop coping mechanisms to deal with it. Remember, you're not alone. The next thing is fear of relapsing, which I kind of touched on when I was talking about being afraid, who is this person that I'm going to be whenever I'm on the other side? Most people who are in recovery from addiction experience some fear of relapse. This is one of the most common fears in recovery and is completely understandable. given the significant risk associated with using drugs or alcohol again. There are many things that can lead to a relapse, such as stress, anxiety, depression, and triggers related to the original addiction. It's important to remember that relapse is not inevitable. With the right support and treatment, though, people in recovery can overcome their fears and build a healthy, sober life. It is also important to remember that if relapse does happen, sobriety is still an option. If you relapse, don't give up. If you're struggling, it means you haven't given up. Because struggling means you're still trying to move forward. You can overcome the obstacles. Okay, so let's see what the Bible has to say about fear. I did not count these myself, but according to Google, the Bible uses the phrase, do not be afraid, 365 times. So there's one for every day. Do not be afraid. Every single day, the Bible says, do not be afraid. So I thought that was cool. God promises, y'all, I'm going to use the Message version just because I felt like as far as like talking, trying to deliver a message or a lesson and everything, it's easier to communicate. Okay, so in Isaiah 41, God says, but you, Israel, are my servant. You're Jacob, my first choice, descendants of my good friend Abraham. I pulled you in from all over the world, called you in from every dark corner of the earth, telling you, you're my servant, serving on my side. I've picked you. I haven't dropped you. Don't panic. I'm with you. There is no need to fear, for I am your God. I'll give you strength. I'll keep you. I'll help you. I'll hold you steady, keeping a firm grip on you. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear. Y'all probably have heard that one. But of power, of love, and of a sound mind. This version says self-discipline, which I think is huge when we talk about recovery and, that self-discipline that we have to practice. Any fear that you have of doing the right thing, or fear of being obedient to God, or fear of taking that next right step is not a fear from God. God gives you power, He gives you love, and He gives you self-discipline to walk through this recovery journey, and you can do it with God's help. Philippians 4:6 says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He's done. That's something that I've mentioned a couple times when I've done victory chips before, was how in the Bible they were usually on the run or moving from one place to another, and they would set up monuments where if they came back through that area, they would see the monument and remember, this is what God did when I was in this place. And so you can do that in your own life. You can, set markers for yourself. Thank God throughout the day for things that He's done. Make note of it in your phone, and then before you go to bed that night, just go through and thank God for everything He's done. And then Psalm 34:4 might sound a little familiar. It says, I prayed to the Lord, and He answered me. Does that sound familiar? I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered. It says he freed me from all of my fears. God is with you whether you feel Him or not. He isn't with you to punish you. He isn't with you to bring down your throat and tell you everything you're doing wrong. He isn't with you because He is with you because He loves you. I skipped a line. He is with you because He said He is an ever-present help, and that's just the way He is. Ever-present. He's not going to give up on you and leave. So, moving on, second half. Okay, let's talk about the children of Israel for a minute. We're gonna go Bible right now, y'all. So, hang with me, and I think it's gonna make a great point. It's raining so hard. Okay, so let's talk about Israel for a minute. Israel, in the Bible, the people of Israel, much like we do, they found themselves caught in another cycle of repenting and crying out to God, and then God forgives them, and He saves them and delivers them, and then they go right back to what they were doing before. And it's a vicious cycle all through the Old Testament. So, in Judges 6, we're going to talk about Gideon. It says, yet again, the people of Israel went back to doing evil in God's sight. Did y'all know relapse was in the Bible? God put them under the domination of Midian for 7 years. Midian overpowered Israel. Because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves hideouts in the mountains, caves, and forts. When Israel planted its crops, Midian and Amalek, the Easterners, would invade them, camp in their fields, and destroy their crops all the way down to Gaza, wherever that is. I don't have a map. They left nothing for them to live on, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. Bringing their cattle in tents, they came in and took over like an invasion of locusts. They marched in and devastated the country. The people of Israel, reduced to grinding poverty by Midian, cried out to God for help. So God put them in this land, and then the Midianites were just taking over. They would plant stuff, and the Midianites would come and take it. They were having trouble surviving. They were living in intense oppression. One time when the people of Israel cried out to God because of Midian, God sent them a prophet with this message. God, the God of Israel, says, I delivered you from Egypt. I freed you from a life of slavery. I rescued you from Egypt's brutality and then from every oppressor. I pushed them out of your way and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am God, your God. Don't for a minute be afraid of the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living, but you didn't listen to me. These people were facing intense adversity. Even after all the times God had delivered them and helped them conquer their enemies, it still took them 7 years to cry out to God in Midian. They were allowing themselves to stay in the same cycle they'd been in for years and years, not rising up as the people of God and conquering the things that were holding them hostage. One day, so we're back to the Bible now. This is back to verse 11. One day the angel of God came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, I think is the name of it, that belonged to Joash, whose son Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress out of the sight of the Midianites. So he was hiding out. He was afraid, and he was hiding out. The angel of God appeared to him and said, God is with you, O mighty warrior. So he's hiding out, and God comes to him and says, I'm with you, you mighty warrior. Like, really? A mighty warrior hiding out? Okay. Gideon replied, with me, my master? If God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the miracle wonders our parents and grandparents told us about, telling us, didn't God deliver us from Egypt? The fact is, God has nothing to do with us. He has turned us over to Midian. So Gideon is angry, he's bitter, he's upset, he's stressed, and he's afraid. But God, the Bible says, but God faced him directly. I can just see it now. Gideon's like whining and complaining and just like venting to this angel about all these terrible things that have happened. And he like says, look at me. Go in this strength that is yours. Save Israel from Midian. Haven't I just sent you? Gideon said to him, me, my master? How and with what could I ever save Israel? Look at me. My clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the runt of the litter. Little me, this isn't Bible, this is Kayla. Little me, who has always been the same, always running, always cowering, always hiding out, and believing life will always be the way that it has been. God said to him, I will be with you. Believe me, you'll defeat Midian. So then Gideon says, if you're serious about this, do me a favor. Let me just make sure, God, that what you're saying is true. Don't leave until I've come back and bring you my gift. So Gideon goes and prepares a meal for the angel of God, and when he brings it back, the angel consumes the meal with fire. That's like typical God. Typical God in the Old Testament to consume a sacrifice with fire. Anyway, so then Gideon knew that that was God. So Gideon said, oh no, I've seen the angel of God face to face. But God reassured him, don't panic. It's all going to be okay. Then Gideon built an altar there, and Gideon built an altar there to God and named it God's Peace. Okay, so let's recap for a second. Gideon had an encounter with God. God confronted him, called him a mighty warrior, whether Gideon believed it or not, and immediately, because of the encounter he had with God, he was able to build an altar and name it God's Peace Just that fast, he knew that he had experienced the peace of God. That very night, God told Gideon to tear down the Baal altar and the Asherah pole, it was a fertility pole, which is kind of weird, but anyway. And build an altar to God on top of the hill. So tear all this stuff down and then build an altar to me on top of the hill where everybody can see it. And use the wood from the Asherah pole for the burnt offering. Gideon was afraid to do this openly, so he did it during the night. And then the next day, all the people of the city are like, what happened to our gods? Like, what? Who has done this? Like, who has torn down these things? Gideon's obedience to God was causing an uproar with the people around him. He's making everybody uncomfortable. All those people that had grown accustomed to the way things were, they had gotten used to being controlled by the enemy and given up on beating them. They had even started worshiping their pagan gods and taking part in their rituals to the fertility god. If you can't beat them, join them, right? Right? Wrong. God had not chosen Israel as the people of God to live in slavery and oppression, no more than he has chosen you and gifted you and brought you to this place tonight so that you could be face to face with him and have the opportunity to choose to take a step in your recovery. He can speak peace to your situation and you can move forward with him. Okay, so all of that happens. Then here come the Midianites and the Amalekites across the river to set up camp in the valley. And the Bible says the Spirit of God came over Gideon. He blew his trumpet and sent messengers calling his army and the neighboring allies to battle, and they all came. But Gideon was still afraid. Okay, verse 36. Gideon said to God, if this is right, if you are using me to save Israel as you've said, then look, I'm placing a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If dew is on the fleece only, but the floor is dry, then I'll know that you're going to use me to save Israel as you said, right? So he's already tested God earlier when he was like, stay here, let me go get your food, and if you're still here when I get back, I'll know you're really God, okay? So now he's like, make the fleece wet and the rest of the ground dry, and I'll know it's really you. So that's what happened. When he got up the next morning, the fleece was wet, enough that he could wring water out of it, and then the ground was dry. But that wasn't enough for Gideon. He's still afraid. He's still not trusting. So he says to God, don't be impatient with me, but let me say one more thing. I want to try another time with the fleece, but this time let the fleece be dry and the ground be wet. And he did it. God did it. God made it happen that very night. Now we're moving to chapter 7. This is where it gets good. Okay, Gideon got up early the next morning. All his troops were there with him. They set up camp at Herod's Spring, wherever that is. The camp of Midian was in the plain north of them, near the hill of Moreh. God said to Gideon, you have too large of an army with you. I can't turn Midian over to them like this. They'll take all the credit, saying that they did it themselves. Make a public announcement. Anyone afraid, anyone who has qualms at all may leave Mount Gilead now and go home. 22 companies headed for home. 10 companies were left. So now we know, like, Gideon's legitimately afraid now. Like, God's telling him to go and defeat these people, and God just took away a third of his army, 2/3 of his army. God said to Gideon, there are still too many. Take them down to the stream, and I'll make a final cut. I promise I'm going to bring it all in a minute. I'll make a final cut. When I say this one goes with you, he'll go. When I say this one doesn't go, he won't go. So Gideon took the troops to the stream, and God said, this is where, I don't know if you've heard this story, but this is where God said, like, if they are getting water from the stream and they cup it in their hand and lap like a dog like this, then they can go. But if they bend down and put their eyes down and lap directly out of the river, they have to go home. So anyway, all of that said, Gideon ends up with only 300 men in his army to defeat this huge army. Okay, after Gideon took all of their provisions and trumpets, he sent all of the Israelites home. He took up his position with the 300. The camp of Midian stretched out below them in the valley. Sometimes, what this kind of said to me is that sometimes we just have too much stuff around us. Like, sometimes we need to just cut out the extra noise, the extra opinions, the extra distractions. That night, God told Gideon, "Get up and go down to the camp. I've given it to you. If you have any doubts about going down," because God knows he's still scared, he's been scared the whole time, "go down with Purah, your armor bearer. When you hear what they're saying, you'll be bold and confident." He and his armor bearer Purah went down near the place where sentries were posted. Midian and Amalek, all the Easterners, were spread out on the plain like a swarm of locusts, which is so scary. And their camels, past counting, like grains of sand in the seashore. Gideon arrived just in time to hear a man tell his friend a dream. So he's down in the camp, like he's down in the enemy's camp with his friend, right? There, all these soldiers and armies are all around him, but they don't know he's there. And so God had already told him, when you hear what they're saying, you're going to be confident. So here he is. He hears this guy. He hears one of the enemy men say, "I had this dream. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp. It came to the tent and hit it so hard that it collapsed. Then it fell." And so the enemy's friend says, "That has to be the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has turned Midian, the whole camp, over to him." When Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he dropped to his knees before God in prayer. Then he went back to the Israelite camp and said, "Get up and get going. God has given us the army." He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. So now there's like 100, 100, and 100 surrounding. He gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch in the jar. He said, "Watch me and do what I do. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly what I do. When I and those with me blow the trumpets, you also around the camp blow your trumpets and shout for God and for Gideon." So it's like 10 o'clock at night. It's dark. They're out in the desert somewhere. And here's what happened. So Gideon and his 100 men got to the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after the sentries had been posted. They blew the trumpets at the same time, smashing the jars they carried. Can you imagine at 10 o'clock at night, someone coming around your tent, blowing trumpets and hitting jars? They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands, ready to blow, and shouted, "A sword for God and for Gideon." They were stationed all around the camp, each man at his post. The whole Midianite camp jumped to its feet. They yelled and fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets, God aimed each Midianite's sword against his companion. God turned them against each other all over camp, and they ran for their lives. So what I want you to get out of this story, thank you for hanging out and listening, is that Gideon was afraid the entire time. From the time God confronted him until the time they blew the trumpets and the Midianite army turned on themselves and fled, Gideon was afraid the whole time. Gideon did not let fear win, though. He decided, "Okay, God, I'm going to obey you. I will step out in faith. I'll do what you're telling me to do, believing that you're going to be true to your promise." And did you notice that the very thing that Gideon was afraid of, the very thing that was keeping the Israelites in oppression, the very thing that was holding them captive, was the thing that ended up running in terror after God was finished? God flipped the script. So I want to tell you, it's okay to be afraid. It's normal to be afraid. But the way that we conquer that fear is we grab the hand of God and we say, "Come with me. We're going to conquer this together, and I believe that you're going to help me." Watch this video, and then we will take care of the chips.